Let's see. Hopefully I can.
Perfect. Okay. Right. Well, seeing as we are less than a minute to go until the start of this session, so I suppose we can do a really brief sort of bit of housekeeping and introduction. So I've obviously introduced myself already, so I can skip that bit. But in terms of how this sort of panel session, parallel session, sorry, is going to run, is we've got two speakers. We should have three, but we've got two speakers across this session, but we will finish as usual at 11:10. So the three talks, as they were supposed to run, would be 3 15-minute talks up to 5 minutes of questions. So that gives us, as I said, gives us to finish at just around 10 past 11ish. As usual, if I can ask people to keep their mics muted, sorry, and put any questions they have in the chat or save them to the end, and we can ensure they get answered. So without further ado, seeing as we are now bang on the money with 10 past, I will pass over to Lee, whose talk is titled Using Eye Tracking Technology to Enhance Decision Making. So over to you, Lee.
Cool. Thank you very much, Max. Thank you very much for joining this session, everyone. This is a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about, and I truly believe it's a little bit of a game changer in regards to understanding our decision making in all kinds of settings. So the aim of the session is to highlight the purpose of coaching, something that's really fitting for today's conference, and also to highlight the importance of decision making, the importance of the eyes, and then also give you some insights into how eye tracking can work and also what it is, because I'm sure some of you may not even be aware of what it actually is, which is perfectly fine because it's relatively new, emerging technology in this sense. So for me, I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology. I've been in the game for about 15 years in terms of teaching at higher education, in further education colleges as well, and also coaching in the real world. So I've got experience within football, within archery, within basketball, ice hockey, cricket. So there's a variety of different sports that I've been involved with. For me, and it is the case for many sports, the purpose of coaching is to introduce a variety of different aspects of technical, tactical, psychological, physical, and social aspects to ensure that we are making the best or trying to enhance holistically the athletes, officials, coaches as we go through. For me, it's a case of looking at both the athlete and the person, because in my opinion, the person, it was there well before the athlete, and the person will be there long after the athlete has gone. So it's a case of trying to understand them both so we can then try and enhance them from a holistic basis, as I say. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is trying to get them to be a self-regulating individual. And what I mean by that is to be self-disciplined, have a belief system, focus on relevant information, but also develop the most important cognitive process, which is decision-making. Self-regulation in regards to decision-making is really important, because we can't make all of the decisions for an athlete on the pitch, on the court, on the rink, in the pool. We can't simply do that because decisions are happening in split-second moments. So ultimately, what we are trying to do, or what we should be aiming to do, is for me to be out of a job, for coaches to be out of a job, in the sense that you have done your job, you've collaborated with the athletes so well that they no longer need you for the area that you've been developing with them. In this sense, decision making. So you've been trying to work on a process to enhance that as we kind of go through. So as I've mentioned very briefly, it is the most important cognitive process we go through, at least in my opinion it is anyway, because they affect us all. They think of the amount of decisions that you have gone through already today. You're literally making decisions now as to whether you should carry on listening to me or join another session. So we are always making these decisions, but in order to make these decisions, we need information. And more importantly, we need the right information to be able to generate the right information, the right decisions. Upwards of 90% of information is picked up through the eyes or the visual system. And it's really important that that is taken into consideration, because when you mention it in that framework or in that context, you then start to discuss with people, well, I would like to improve my athletes' decision-making, or officials or coaches' decision-making. And then when you ask them, how much focus do you place on the eyes? Not all that many say that they actually do. So this is something that is really coming to the fore, and eye tracking is a way or a method to be able to look at this. I typically introduce this kind of concept when talking about speed training, because if you think about speed training, the hamstrings are a vital component of speed training. It's acknowledged, it's well documented, and there are specific exercises dedicated to that within the gym. So there's things like Nordic extensions and such like. Let's think about it from decision making in terms of the eyes. The eyes are a vital component, so let's start focusing on them like we do the hamstrings in speed training. I'd just like you to close your eyes. So just a little activity before we go into a little bit more, but I'd just like you to close your eyes wherever you are now, as long as it's safe to do so. And I just want you to think about, what do you see? Now, I'm very, very well aware that I've just asked you to close your eyes, but what do you see in your mind's eye as to what your surroundings are? With your eyes closed, think about what's to your left, what's to your right, what's in front of you, behind you. Can you see further than that? Can you see through doors? Those kind of things, just in your mind's eye. Now, of course, you can open your eyes now, but this is a very simple activity to tell us how well you use your visual system. And it can be used in any coaching session straight away. Set up a simple drill, set up a simple activity, get your athletes to stop, stand still, close their eyes, and then get them to reflect on what they actually see. Because during this activity, it tells you how their search patterns are. It tells you what their memory's like. It tells you what they focus on. It tells you how far that focus expands as well. Because if their knowledge actually only goes 5 yards, if it goes 10 yards, 20 yards, it gives you an indicator of how far they are searching. And it's such a simple activity to gain a vital insight into what is being focused on and what is not. Now, moving on to eye tracking, more specifically, we are looking at something that is a development of head cams or body cams and things like that. So head cams are really, really interesting, and they're really easy to place on any sport that has helmets. So things like ice hockey, American football, cricket, sports of this ilk. They give you some interesting results. They tell you the direction that people are looking at. It tells you the scope in which people are looking at, and it gives you insights into what they possibly may be going through when making decisions. However, they don't tell you everything. They tell you a direction, but they don't tell you what people are looking with. So there is a history behind eye tracking. And my own personal history is kind of depicted on this slide here, in the sense that one of my favorite films is The Terminator, and that had a scanner going all over the screen at that point. That was back in the late 80s, early 90s. So that's how far back we go. The original eye tracker was built actually over 100 years ago, and it directly touched the eyeball. And as your eye moved, so did the piece of apparatus. My first experience with an eye tracker was actually the eye tracker that you can see in the middle two pictures with the linesman and the football player. You had to wear these very jazzy glasses, and you had to then wear a backpack and a laptop. So you ended up running a bit around like a Ghostbuster, which did prove to be a little bit of an issue in dynamic situations. But the technology has evolved significantly, and you no longer have to do that. And I'll show you the pieces of technology as we go through. But now I just thought I'd go through a series of case studies that are really useful in this sense, that we are able to gain some really interesting insights into what people look at during certain situations. So during my PhD, my first study was actually looking at assistant referees, what they look at during offside decisions, an incredibly dynamic situation with so much going on. A headcam would simply not do it, simply wouldn't cut the mustard in this sense, because we don't know exactly what they're looking at. A key part of this process and a key part of my practice is that you use the eye tracker to understand what they look at, but then you have a reflective process and discussion with them to understand why they're looking at certain things. One of the key findings for an assistant referee to make an offside decision in this study was to look at the grass. And although that sounds very strange, actually what they were doing was looking at the grass as what's called a gaze anchor. So they were looking at a certain part of the grass, depending on how it was cut, and then they would filter to the player on the ball, back to the grass, the last defender, back to the grass, the furthest forward attacker, back to the grass. And you could see this quite happily on the eye tracker as it was just darting around, and it measures how our eyes are looking as we go through. From a basketball sense, one of the key messages from that coaches have told me when I've worked within basketball is that they get instructed to tell their players to focus on the belly button to judge direction. Once again, this was an example of gaze anchoring when we were looking at from the eye tracker perspective. It wasn't the belly button was not the only thing that was focused on. Actually, it was a case of the players were looking at the belly button to go to the hip, back to the belly button, to the shoulders, back to the belly button, to the feet, back to the belly button. Now, this just gave you an insight into actually what the belly button is said to be important. It's been misconstrued that it's the only thing that you should focus on. What has been found within this novel case study is that actually it's useful, but other things need to be taken into consideration. Now, the picture you can see here is something that we see live as we go through. So you've got some delightful pictures of their eyes as they go through, and you can see their eye movement and what they're looking at. I also did some work within archery. And what the interesting thing is, as you can see, is from the picture, is this is all they have to wear now in terms of the very streamlined glasses. They're very easy to use, very easy to calibrate, and they can be used in very simple and dynamic situations. Within cricket, very simple to put underneath a helmet, as long as the helmet allows it to, because there are some limitations as we'll go through in a second. The cricket case study allowed us to see that actually it's not the ball that is the sole focus of the batter. They go through a process of trying to understand what the bowler does for certain bowls. So whether they're a spinner, whether they are a fast bowler, seamer, those kind of things. Ice hockey is arguably the most dynamic sport of all, and they work well within this setting from both players and officials' perspective. As you can see from the pictures, specifically on the left-hand side, there is a small red cursor, and that is exactly what the player is looking at any given point during this session, during the process of making decisions. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, we made a bit of eye tracking history, where I was working with the International Ice Hockey Federation, and we were using the eye tracker during live sanctioned games at the Under-18 Men's World Championships. First game within the USA versus Latvia, and the officials were actually using eye trackers during the game to understand what they were doing, so we could understand the effects of emotions. We can understand what they were looking at during certain incidents, such as boarding, such as slashing, all of these kind of incidents that were going on within an incredibly dynamic sport. if nothing else, it's really highlighted how much information an ice hockey official has to take in, as well as this little thing called skating. Now, alongside all eye tracking stuff, I find it really, really useful to be able to do something called a think aloud protocol, because the eye tracker has the capacity to record voice, or record audio, I should say. So as they go through, we didn't obviously during the officials World Championships, because that may have hindered their processes. But during training, it's really interesting to go through that process. They verbalize what they do. Period of reflection afterwards, we can see things live, but we can also look at things retrospectively. So we can look at things after the event and go through the information, go through the footage with the officials, with the coaches, with the players, and understand why they're doing what they're doing. And then ultimately, what it does gear into is what are the aims and outcomes for each of the sessions. So each coach or each player has their own kind of aims and outcomes for each session. This then builds into that to be able to assist that process. So we try and understand what they look at, why they look at it, in what order, and we try and filter what's the best pieces of information to make decisions more effectively and consistently. Now, that's a very, very whistle-stop tour of what eye tracking is in this short 15-minute period. I'm sorry I've gone over by a minute. But the aim of this session was to try and highlight the purpose for the coaching, decision-making, importance of the eyes, and effectiveness of eye tracking. So that's it from me. And if you do have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you very much for listening.
That's perfectly. Thank you. I mean, actually, you were probably only over about 15 seconds because we started a bit late. So you did pretty well there. Did pretty well. Thank you for a fantastic talk. Do we have any questions from the floor? Feel free to jump on the mic or put your hand up or put something in the chat. So I have a question. Is there, in doing your sort of applied work and research work, have you found any differences between novices and experts in terms of the decision-making process and the eye tracking data, and what do those differences look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So typically, from a novice perspective, novices are quite, it's like, for want of a better phrase, it's a little bit of a scattergun approach. So when you hook them up to the eye trackers, they're typically looking at everything. And that's typically because they don't have memories, knowledge of what to look at and what informs their decisions. From an expert's perspective, they are fewer fixations or fewer areas of interest, but they last for longer because they're gaining that piece of information from those from those bits that they have learned through the past. So it could be an opponent that they may have already come across and they know about them, or just from previous experiences in other games, other scenarios, those kind of things. But yeah, very broadly, the typical difference is novices have more areas of interest and it's very scattery, so to speak, with experts being more deliberate in their processes, where it's kind of more calculated in what they look at and why they look at it.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions from the floor? We've probably got time for one more. Someone's got one? Yeah, Emma.
It's really interesting you're talking about using it in sports on helmets. I'm a British show jumper, and unfortunately the BSJ has banned sort of like anything that's attached to your helmet. So we use it in training, and it's actually really useful because, as you said, so even though it's not eye tracking, it's just very useful to see exactly what I'm doing with my head, sort of like weight-wise, but also sort of what I'm focusing on around the course. There are sort of cameras and things out there that can attach to helmets, incredibly expensive, and they're a little bit iffy with the BSJ because they're kind of like, are they or are they not? How are you finding that? You mentioned, I believe it was with cricket, that there was an issue potentially putting it on the helmets. How are you getting around that in sort of like more top sports?
Yeah, so it's a really, really good question because, yeah, as you say, I'm in no way am I poo-pooing kind of helmet cams, because they do give you some really interesting information. It's just that the eye tracker is obviously specifically telling us what's going on. Actually, with the eye tracker, because they're a set of glasses, they can just fit under the helmets, but it really does depend on where padding lies. So it's like the design of how the padding goes within the helmets. So when I was recently with the ice hockey guys, small helmets were the only helmets that we had an issue with, just simply because they were a lot closer to the skull, and the design was slightly different to the medium and the large. But it was still able to be manipulated in, so you were able to put it in, just applying pressure in the right places. So they do work for those instances, and it does typically depend on the design of the helmet as to whether you put the glasses on, then put the helmet on, or whether it's the helmet on and then the glasses. But it completely depends on the design of the helmet in that instance. But they do work in that sense.
Okay, well, if you're interested in doing anything with horses and riding, by all means, I'll take it on.
I think that'd be fantastic. However, I used to have horses as when I was younger, so always got a keen interest in horses. So I think that'd be a great place to start looking.
Great, thank you very much.
Cool, thanks, Emma.
So thank you very much, Lee. We have a little pause in this room now for about 20 minutes because we haven't got a speaker, but we have got a speaker lined up for the third slot, which starts at 10 to 11. So feel free to